Yeah, my car just died on Route 9. Send a tow.
Hey, Care. It's Ethan. Long story. Call me back.
Well, hey there, you look soaked.
Something like that.
That's what explains.
Good? Give me a second.
On a freezing Tuesday night in Columbus, Ohio, a billionaire sat alone in his car outside a diner he had never noticed in his life. He had no driver waiting outside, no assistant trailing 2 steps behind him, and for the first time in almost 20 years, no plan for what came next. The neon sign above the door flickered between open and darkness, as if it could not decide whether it wanted him there at all. What happened inside that diner over the following hour would quietly rearrange the rest of his life, and the woman who served him would never see it coming. His name was Ethan Caldwell, and by every outward measure, he had already won at life. At 44, he controlled a hotel and hospitality company with properties across 11 countries, a private jet he rarely flew for pleasure, and a net worth that financial magazines liked to print in bold red numbers. None of it meant anything to him that night. His marriage had ended 18 months earlier in a quiet, expensive divorce that left him with houses but no home. His father had passed away the year before that. So why was a man worth billions parked outside a roadside diner in the rain, too tired to even reach for the door handle? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The diner was called Dot's Kitchen, named after a grandmother who had opened it 40 years earlier with a coffee pot and a recipe book held together by rubber bands. The granddaughter who ran it now, 29-year-old Grace Bennett, had inherited both the building and the debt that came with it. She worked 6 nights a week, closed the register herself, and drove home in a car with a check engine light that had been on so long she had given it a nickname. That night, she was alone behind the counter, wiping down a clean table simply because standing still made her think about bills she could not pay. The diner always smelled the same no matter the season, fryer oil layered under fresh coffee and the faint sweetness of pie cooling on the back counter. A bell above the door announced every customer, the jukebox in the corner only ever played country and gospel, and the floor creaked in the same 2 spots no amount of repair work ever fixed. Grace knew every sound that diner made the way other people knew their own heartbeat, which was exactly why, on quiet nights, the silence between customers felt louder than anything else in her life. Grace's father, Walter, had worked at the same auto plant for 31 years before a stroke left the left side of his body too weak to trust. His medical bills arrived in envelopes Grace had learned to open only after her morning coffee, never before. The diner her grandmother built was the only thing standing between her family and losing the house Walter had paid off 3 years before he got sick. Grace never told customers any of this. She smiled, refilled coffee, and remembered regulars' birthdays and grandchildren's names, because that was simply who she was, whether anyone was watching or not. Ethan had not planned to be anywhere near that diner. Earlier that evening, he had sat through a shareholder call on the exact anniversary of his father's funeral, nodding along to numbers he could not focus on. Afterward, instead of calling his driver, he had taken his own car out for the first time in months, just to feel like a man steering something instead of being steered. Somewhere on a dark stretch of county road, his engine had sputtered and given out near a cluster of storefronts he did not recognize, leaving him with a choice between sitting in the cold or walking toward the only light still on. When the bell over the door rang at 9:15, Grace looked up expecting a trucker or a teenager craving fries before a late movie. Instead, a tall man in a raincoat dress shirt walked in, no tie, no jacket, rain still clinging to his shoulders like he had forgotten umbrellas existed. He looked, she would later admit, like someone who had been crying in his car for longer than he wanted anyone to know. She did not ask questions. She simply said, "Sit anywhere you like, honey, kitchen still open," and went to get him a glass of water. Ethan stared at the laminated menu for a long moment, the words swimming in front of him, before quietly admitting he was not even sure what he wanted. Grace studied him for a second, then closed the menu gently and told him she had something better than anything printed on that page. 10 minutes later she set down a plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a biscuit still warm enough to fog the air above it, made from her grandmother's recipe rather than anything resembling a special. She had no idea the man across from her had eaten in some of the finest restaurants on 5 continents. She only knew he looked like someone who needed a warm plate and nobody asking him for anything in return. Ethan took one bite and, to his own surprise, had to set down his fork and press the back of his hand against his eyes for a moment. It was not that the food was extraordinary in any way a critic would write about. It was that nobody had cooked for him simply because they wanted him to feel less alone, in longer than he could remember. Grace noticed but did not make a show of it. She refilled his coffee without being asked, told him to take his time, and went back to wiping down a counter that was already clean, giving him the privacy to put himself back together. "Are you all right, honey?" Grace asked, sliding a fresh napkin across the counter without being asked twice. Ethan nodded, then admitted, in a voice rougher than he meant it to sound, that it had simply been a long year. Grace did not pry. She only said the biscuits were free for long years, and refilled his coffee, leaving him exactly the silence he needed. He came back 3 nights later, then twice the following week, always alone, always paying in cash, always sitting in the corner booth by the window where the old heater rattled every few minutes like a man clearing his throat. Grace started setting out the same plate before he even sat down, and somewhere in the second week, she began calling him by name, because he had finally given her one. He told her his name was Ethan and that he worked in hotels, which was true enough not to feel like a lie, even though it left out every zero that came after it. One slow Wednesday night, Grace finally told him why she still kept an old anatomy textbook tucked under the diner's register. "I wanted to be a nurse once," she admitted, tracing a circle on the counter with her finger. "Plans changed when my dad got sick." Ethan asked if she regretted it. She thought about it longer than he expected before answering, "Some nights, but he's still here because I stayed, so I can't really call that a mistake." Ethan never forgot how simply she said it, without asking for sympathy or expecting anyone to fix it for her. Some nights, when the diner emptied out early, Grace let him help close up, more for the company than the help. She taught him how to season the griddle the way her grandmother had, laughing the first time he scorched a perfectly good spatula trying to flip an egg too fast. Ethan, who had not laughed at his own mistakes in years, found himself doing exactly that, standing in a closing diner in a button-down shirt that had never once been pressed by a stranger, host to a happiness so plain and unremarkable that he almost did not recognize it as the thing he had been missing his entire life. Over weeks of black coffee and warm biscuits, Ethan learned that Grace had wanted to study nursing once, before her father's stroke rearranged every plan she had for her own future. He learned she sometimes fell asleep doing the diner's books in the very booth she served other people in. He learned she still missed her grandmother every single day, especially when she stirred gravy the same slow way the old woman had taught her at 8 years old. And somewhere in those quiet weeks, without meaning to, Ethan Caldwell, a man who could buy entire city blocks before lunch, fell in love with a woman who had no idea he could afford to. On the nights he could not make it to the diner, Ethan sat in a penthouse that occupied an entire floor, surrounded by art he had bought because someone told him it was a good investment, eating meals prepared by a private chef and eating completely alone at a table built for 12. He found himself missing the rattle of a broken heater more than he missed anything money had ever bought him. He told himself he would explain everything to Grace soon, that there would be an obvious right moment to say who he really was. He kept choosing, night after night, to stay a man named Ethan who worked in hotels just a little bit longer. Then one Thursday night, Grace finally told him the truth she had been hiding behind every smile. The bank had given her 30 days before they took the diner, and with it, the only roof her father had left. She apologized for even saying it out loud to a customer, wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, and turned back toward the register so he would not see her cry. Ethan sat there with his coffee going cold, and for the first time since walking through that door in the rain, he understood exactly what he had to decide. And that is when everything he had been hiding nearly cost him the one person who had never asked him for anything. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching," and let's see who is truly following all the way to the end. Ethan did not sleep that night. He sat in his car outside Dot's kitchen long after the lights went out, running every option through his head the way he once ran corporate negotiations, except this time there was no contract that could protect him from being truly known. He could write a check that erased the debt in one signature and disappear before she ever learned his last name. Or he could finally tell her the truth he had been avoiding for 2 months, knowing it might cost him the only thing in his life that had felt completely real. By morning, Ethan had made a decision, though not the one he expected to make. Before setting anything up, he made one call to his longtime advisor, Russell Pierce, who urged him to stay away from the diner entirely until the divorce gossip surrounding him quieted down, warning that any connection to an unknown woman in Ohio could become exactly the kind of story tabloids love twisting into something ugly. Ethan listened to every warning, thanked Russell for his honesty, and then did the one thing 30 years of careful business decisions had taught him never to do. He ignored every piece of good advice he had just been given. He called his attorney instead and quietly set up a small trust to pay off the diner's loan in full, structured so the bank would record it as resolved without naming a source. He did not do it to impress Grace or to be discovered as a hero. He did it because he could not stand the thought of her losing her grandmother's diner over a debt that meant nothing to him and everything to her, whether or not she ever found out who had paid it. Then he planned to finally tell her the truth himself, the very next time he saw her. Before Ethan could find the right words, a regular customer slid her phone across the counter the next morning instead. A small local business column had run two blurry but unmistakable photographs of Ethan Caldwell sitting in a corner booth of a diner the writer could not quite identify. Grace read the article twice, her stomach dropping further with each line, then looked up at the empty booth by the window where the heater still rattled every few minutes. She did not feel like she had found a secret admirer. She felt like she had been a stranger's experiment, and she did not yet know that her unopened loan papers had already been quietly resolved a week earlier. When Ethan walked in that evening, Grace did not bring him coffee. She stood behind the counter with her arms crossed and asked, in a voice flatter than he had ever heard from her, whether anything he had told her in the past 2 months had been true. He said yes, every word, except the one thing he had never said out loud, which was exactly how much money sat in his name. He told her he had not come to that diner looking for anything to write about or anyone to test. He told her the simpler, harder truth was that for the first time in years, he had found somewhere nobody wanted anything from him, and he had been terrified that telling her who he really was would ruin the only honest thing he had left. Grace told him to leave, and he did, without arguing, because he understood she needed the room to feel whatever she needed to feel without him standing there making it about his own guilt. For 3 days, he did not return, and Grace did not expect him to. She kept walking, kept smiling at strangers, kept pretending the corner booth did not feel different now that it sat empty every night. She told herself she was angry at being lied to, and she was, but underneath that anger sat something quieter and harder to admit, which was simply how much she missed talking to him. Late one of those nights, lying awake long after closing, Grace admitted to herself what she had not said out loud to anyone, not even her father. She was not only angry that Ethan had hidden his fortune. She was afraid of what it meant that the truth had not changed how she felt about him, only how safe she felt admitting it. Loving a man with that much money felt like a different kind of risk than the ones she already carried, and she did not know yet whether she had the strength left to take it. It was Grace's father, Walter, who finally said what neither of them could. Sitting near the diner's back office one evening in his wheelchair, he mentioned that the bank had called nearly a week earlier, not to demand payment, but to confirm that the full balance on Dot's kitchen had already been cleared through an anonymous trust. Grace had assumed it was a clerical error and left the letter in a drawer, too afraid to believe it was real. When she finally understood the payment had gone through 3 full days before any newspaper ever printed Ethan's name, something in her anger loosened. He had not paid to be forgiven for being caught. He had paid quietly, before anyone outside that diner even knew he had ever existed there at all. It took Grace nearly 3 weeks to let Ethan sit in the booth by the window again, and even then, she made him agree to one condition before she poured his coffee. She would repay every dollar of that loan herself, on her own schedule, because the diner was hers to save, not his to rescue. Ethan agreed without hesitation, understanding for the first time that love built on equal footing meant something he had never actually had in his life, despite owning more buildings than he could count. Slowly, the corner booth stopped being where a stranger ate alone, and became where 2 people built something far more valuable than either of them had originally been searching for. In the months that followed, Ethan learned the diner's rhythms the way regulars do, which booth caught the morning sun, which customer always wanted her coffee topped off before she finished asking, which song on the radio made Grace hum along without realizing it. He still owned hotels across 11 countries, but most evenings found him exactly where he wanted to be, drying dishes behind a counter in Columbus, Ohio, slowly learning that the life he had built and the life he actually wanted to live had turned out to be two very different things. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday night that looked almost exactly like the one where it all began, Ethan asked Grace to marry him in that same corner booth, with the heater still rattling every few minutes in the background. He did not do it with cameras or a private island or anything that belonged to the life reporters liked writing about. He did it with a ring small enough to fit inside a coffee mug, and a promise that no matter how many zeros ever sat in his name again, he would never let her forget that she had loved him first, back when he had nothing to offer her but a wrinkled shirt and an empty stomach. Grace said yes before he even finished the sentence, laughing through tears the same way she had the night he finally told her the truth. Dot's kitchen is still open today, the loan paid back in full by Grace herself, with the corner booth reserved by a small handwritten sign that nobody is allowed to explain to new customers, no matter how many times they ask. Walter sits there most Sunday mornings, watching his daughter run a business her grandmother would have been proud of, beside a son-in-law who finally learned that the most expensive thing he ever owned meant nothing until somebody loved him without knowing its price. Stories like Ethan and Grace's make you wonder how often real connection gets missed because somebody is too afraid to be seen without their title, their money, or their armor. If you were sitting in Grace's position, discovering that the stranger you fed every week for 2 months had been hiding something that large, would you have forgiven him the way she did, or would the silence have cost him everything? And if you were Ethan, would you have told her the truth sooner, even knowing it might end the only honest connection you had left? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what you would have done if this happened to you. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories like this one, because sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin over the simplest, most ordinary meal.